minutes.
Sharing time with Deputy Darragh O'Brien, John Lahart, James Brown, Neil Smith and James Lawless.
To cut your costs accordingly.
Absolutely, Last Count Corda. Every day we hear stories of individuals, families, communities right around the country that have been devastated by drugs. Drug-related harm consistently clusters in communities marked by poverty and social inequality. And it is in this background that Fianna Fáil will be supporting the motion as presented by Independence for Change and Deputy Collins. We're also putting forward, and I'd like to formally move, a number of amendments. And I want to be clear on this, that the amendments are in no way to detract from the substantial motion being brought forward, but arise specifically from a briefing meeting held by Deputy Collins with Citywide, and they're being tabled in that context, and I hope the proposers of the motion will be able to accept the amendments in that regard. The amendments specifically deal with the need to restore annual core funding, an annual increase in core funding to drug task forces, and to ensure that today's debate in this chamber continues subsequently at committee in the Oireachtas Health Committee. I think that's quite important. Minister, in all of my discussions, and I think it's important to put on the record of the House, in all of my discussions it's important to put forward the point that the national drug strategy that you developed and you led and you oversaw receives widespread public support from the community and voluntary sector and the statutory players. And that's a very, very important statement to make, because as you well know, governments come and go and ministers come and go, but the strategy will span a number of governments, and it's important that there's widespread buy-in to it, and there is. But the purpose of today's debate is substantially to look at the implementation of the strategy. The first point to make, and it has been made, but it's important to state, is the programme for government itself, which is almost 3 years old, commits to expanding the projects supported by local drug task forces. There has been no increase in core funding over the last 5 years. And while the funding partners, as in the HSE and the Department of Health, have seen significant increases in their budgets, the funding to each individual drug task force has remained static. And while every other cost has gone up, that really, in real terms, in purchasing power, is effectively a stealth cut on those. And they all feel it. And there are members of this House who are members of task forces, as you well know, Minister, and they can relay accurately to you what the impacts they're having. And that's why it's important that not alone we address the issue of emerging needs, but core funding to support existing projects needs to be increased, and needs to be increased on an annual basis to ensure the long-term viability and sustainability of those programmes. Minister, I acknowledge that today or yesterday you announced £1 million additional funding, and I've questioned you in the House before, and you have indicated quite clearly that there would be additional funding. You didn't say how much until now, and I welcome the funding. But I want to make this point clear, that you haven't clearly identified, and you said there would be discussion with the task forces. What I'm saying to you, Minister, is a substantial amount of money on an annual basis must be found to maintain existing core services and core funding to task forces before we go and move on to additional funding. That's critically important. And I think in your discussions with them, you need to set aside a proportion of that funding to support core funding to task forces. If the entire £1 million, by the way, were just given to support additional funding to core task forces, it would indicate an increase per task force of 3.5%. So it's not anything excessive, and people shouldn't get carried away. It sounds a lot, $1 million, but when you look at the projects that are being supported, so I'd say that point. And I do want to acknowledge last year there was funding for one-off projects, but one-off projects are not the same as the long-term viability of the projects underpinned by the task forces. Minister, the one element that Citywide have identified and have expressed concern is the input, the commitment and support of some of the statutory players and the bodies. And, we often hear they may or may not attend various task force meetings and so forth. So I did a small exercise, and I'm not going to read it all into the record. So I looked and I did a number of parliamentary questions to ask of the attendance. But to give you one department, and I'm not going to name the department and I can show you afterwards, it wouldn't be fair to pick one department over another. They sat on 1 local and 3 regional task forces. And effectively, their attendance was at only half the number of meetings. And that supports the claim that is made by the Citywide and the community sector, that oftentimes the statutory players are in non-attendance. And I think, it is an important element that we address. The issue was raised by some of the previous speakers in relation to the whole area of decriminalisation. It is a sad thing to say that as we debate here today, we know on an annual basis there are in the region of 700 drug-related deaths per annum. More than 4 times as many people will die from a drug-related death than will die from a road fatality this year. The numbers are staggering. And, you know, we have the opportunity to make a difference and do things differently. Decriminalisation is not legalisation. It is not a get-out-of-jail card. And decriminalisation, will only work if the other supports are in place at that time. So, in other words, the whole focus is diverting people from the criminal justice system to health and educational and other supports. And I suppose the model we use and we look at is how they did it in Portugal. Portugal has a population more than double the population of our country. And if you look at the figures for those who died as a related drug overdose, in Ireland for the last years that were available, the figure is 220-something people. And the comparable figure in Portugal, with a population twice our size, is 27 people. There are huge inroads and huge gains to be made, but decriminalisation on its own, without the health and educational supports being in place at that point in time, are not sufficient. Finally, Minister, I know you've put down your own counter motion, but I want to put on the record and acknowledge that you have said and have acknowledged that you will attend the Oireachtas committee. I believe in the time available to us in this House we don't get adequate time to delve into the details of the implementation of the strategy. I welcome your commitment to attend the committee because I believe we can tease out some of these points in further detail. Gurmagat.